Hello and welcome to the Macroeconomics Hot Topics, Packs 1 to 10 with me, Mr. Davis. I'm going to take a look through pack by pack through the macro course, look at some hot topics that have not been tested before, and some essays which potentially could be asked in these different packs. As you saw in the micro video, hot topics just means something that's never come up in the final exam before. It's never been as part of a specific question. And hot topic essays, these are ones, again, they may have been tested in other areas, such as a 10 marker, a 12 marker, a multiple choice, but they've not specifically been in the list of essays they've set. And as I said in the micro video, I think it's important to look at some of those because I don't think they're going to repeat themselves. I'm not going to say the same essays necessarily in the summer because they've got so many essays that it could do. It's only 2 per year that they can put in. So there's a lot of essays that they have not touched yet, which we have a look at. So we'll go through pack by pack now and look at those for each of those packs. So in terms of pack 1 is economic growth. There's a few little gaps here they haven't sort of tested. GDP versus GNI. I mean, I've had some GNI data in the exam, but not really asking you what it is or defining it or explaining why it's different to GDP. The UK national wellbeing area. So I put something in Year 12 exam last year trying to test that. The idea of how the ONS measures national wellbeing, looking at a range of subjective and objective measures. It's not aggregated, it's like a dashboard, and you can look at different indicators to see how different things are in terms of wellbeing for the UK. There's a few quantitative skills things here as well. Converting from money to real terms, that's something that they've never tested. And it's surprising because it was a new thing they brought into the specification like 10 years ago, whatever it was, and they've just not put it in. So I've got another example there in terms of using the CPI data to try and adjust the $40,000 there into real terms. Yeah, they've not even looked at median, mean, quantiles. I mean, they're not going to ask you much about those. So you get them to maybe define them maybe or interpret some data, but they've not done that. And these adjusted figures, I mean, they have used these adjusted figures, but they've never really got you to think about maybe a question about why would you use those. So some questions there on the right hand side covering those hot topics. In terms of a sort of hot topic essay, I wondered about sort of the UK's long-term growth rate. This is something that Kwasi Kwarteng was trying to improve. It's what Labour government's trying to improve. And so there's some policy stuff there, productivity, you can link with AI potentially, migrations. There's a lot of factors that shifts along an aggregate supply, which could influence the UK's long-term growth rate, and it has been an issue. We think this has fallen. So factors influencing, reasons why it's slowed down, policies to improve it, those sort of things could be a potential essay in terms of growth maybe. In terms of Pack 2 on the other macroeconomic objectives, they've sort of run through a lot of these in terms of, like last year they ticked off economic inactivity, so that was gone. They did a bit more on the balance of payments last year, so they've ticked up a couple that were in this PowerPoint last year. Underemployment has not been mentioned, so having to think about what that means in terms of having a job but not having full number of hours. You're part-time, you're only full-time, you're in a second choice occupation maybe. So that's something you could have to think about. As I did a bit more on the balance of payments last year. In the Year 12 content, we talk about the impact on other objectives, so essentially how it affects the circular flow with net injections and withdrawals, and on a very basic level, interconnectedness of different countries through trade. So why would trade lead to that? I mean, in the Year 13 content, there's a lot more detail on trade, but that is something in the Year 12 bit where it could be a short question on that. I haven't done so far. In fact, I haven't done a lot on pros and cons of trade in that sense. Seeing a question here, hot topic essay. So I've put the macroeconomic effects of rising immigration for the UK economy. So potentially that's an area where they could be testing in terms of the impact on unemployment, employment, potential growth, and jobs, skill. I mean, there's a lot of different areas, public services, tax revenue. There's a lot of ways in which that could be topical for the UK, and you could bring in a lot of your knowledge with that. In terms of aggregate demand and supply, so a few little minor gaps here that they haven't tested. This gross versus net investment is a very specific topic. Factors influencing government spending, so fiscal policy and the trade cycle. Distinction between short run and long run aggregate supply. I mean, whether they'd actually go as far as asking a question on that, I do not know, but I've put one there. And certainly in last year's paper, they had quite a bit on short run aggregate supply in its own right. So in terms of the essay, I mean, in the past they've had questions that focus on negative output gaps, but maybe the positive output gap that we had following the pandemic when our growth was very fast, maybe the implications of that, they've never got you to specifically draw a positive output gap, aggregate demand and supply. So that's something, again, potential essay, but a lot of the time aggregate demand and supply is something you use as part of your essay. So usually packs 1, 2, and 3 are not as heavily tested in terms of essays, but these are ones to think about that they could do, or the more likely one, I suppose. Then into sort of macro policy and conflicts. Nothing specific on the role of the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee, inflation targeting, the factors they consider when they're making those decisions. So that's something they could test. Not really a lot on Great Depression and financial crisis. So sort of a couple of the 2 marker on that. Never mentioned the Great Depression in any sense, and that's again is surprising given they brought that in as a new topic. You think maybe there's somewhere where they could test that. I've put a sort of essay here that would allow you to bring in knowledge of the UK and the US and who had a better policy response. And there's no obviously right or wrong answer to that question. There's different views on that, but hopefully you could see a 2-sided argument potentially for that. Lots of the supply side policy has been tested. I'm sort of waiting for a question potentially where they ask you on market-orientated supply side policies or interventionist supply side policies and get you to just choose from those selections. Most questions we've seen on supply side policies, in fact, all of them really, are just supply side policies in general, and you can choose from any. But I think it would be reasonable for them to not like question 2 there to narrow it down to market-orientated or interventionist. But I mean, supply side policies, I mean, it's weird to put it there as a hot topic. I mean, it comes up a lot. But those specific types of supply side policy, less so. And a short run Phillips curve. So I put something on this either last year or the year before in the Year 12 exam, looking at some data. I mean, in the previous specification, they gave people some data on unemployment and inflation. They got them to think about whether that relationship is true. And if you look at the recent times, a lot of the relationship is true in the sense that inflation rose dramatically after the pandemic and the cost of living crisis. Unemployment was low, and then it fell back to target and unemployment started to rise. But now inflation's rising and unemployment's rising. So that sense with the Phillips curve of the data and looking at data and working out that inverse relationship happens. And I really think you need to be able to draw the short and Phillips curve and show something on it. So that could be a potential like 4 marker where they get you to draw the Phillips curve and show that trade-off, maybe showing an increase in inflation and dropping unemployment potentially. But I say there's a lot of essays on this as well. There's more popular essays on pack 4 potentially than 1 to 3. So on fiscal and monetary and that sort of thing, quantitative easing. So that's what I said there about the Great Depression potentially being one they haven't looked at before. In terms of role of the state, again, there's a few things they've not touched on. Structural versus cyclical deficit, they've never really covered that. I mean, there's been questions about budget deficit. There was one last summer, but nothing where they get you to really go like that question, that 10 marker, like which is more of a concern, with the idea that cyclical deficit would reduce over time, with the trade cycle, but usually it's quite much smaller part of the overall deficit, so it's less of a concern for both those reasons really. But other things like reasons for the factors in the size and composition of the UK's public expenditure, so what's determining how much we're spending, the pandemic or austerity or fiscal policy or being in a recession, but also the composition of it. So, the pandemic would have switched really spending towards healthcare and towards furlough and welfare. some way. So not just the size of it, but what sort of things are being spent on. Same with Labour Party coming in. There's increased the size of the public expenditure, and that competition is more on things that are trying to get public services, health, education, that sort of thing going, and increasing welfare potentially. So that's sort of the reasons behind it. Same thing on the public sector finances, those factors influencing the deficit and the debt. So a sort of causation question is something that I haven't really covered off on this situation, and would be a strong choice for an essay from their point of view to get you to bring in, especially in the UK context, what reasons are there for our changing deficit, debt, or government spending. I think that's a really good one where you can draw in the material from year 12 UK, and policies response to external shocks. Nothing external shocks, despite the number of external shocks we've seen through, obviously, Iran war. You've got the Ukraine war, you've got the pandemic, you've got the financial crisis, Great Depression. So there's a lot of external shocks that they could test you on there, and thinking about the policies and how it's more difficult to respond to maybe supply side shocks than maybe demand side shocks. So the poverty and inequality. Poverty and inequality. Again, most of these things have been sort of ticked off the list now in terms of hot topics. That economic change and inequality, the Kuznets curve, how industrialisation could affect inequality, is a topic they've not touched on. And policies to reduce poverty specifically. So you can see like an essay there, maybe a developing country, how to reduce poverty. Could you use Ghana there? What sort of things in Ghana could they do? But in question 2, you can see maybe the UK. There's been an increase in relative poverty. So what could the UK government do to reduce relative poverty? So this could be a developing or developed country sort of topic, potentially. So international economics part 1. Again, a few things are not tested. Again, like there's policies to control global companies, regulating transfer pricing. So they've not tested that at all. That again, I mean, they've sort of gone away from that method a little bit in terms of trying to do a sort of minimum corporation tax in the G7, but it's a policy, there's a thing they've never tested. It was a new topic for the specification, so that's question 1 there. I mean, the pros and cons of trade, potentially that could be quite a nice essay in terms of a trade essay. We did one for homework. Protectionism, the reasons, like, so why is there protectionism? I mean, it's still so topical. So a question on the reasons and potentially the types. Every question we've had so far really focused on tariffs, not on quotas or subsidies or non-tariff barriers. There's a bit of scope there. Also WTO. Nothing on the WTO and their role sort of promoting trade liberalisation and the rules they're setting. There's been a lot of disputes that they've resolved over time, but also their dispute itself with Donald Trump wanting to maybe not have the WTO or being against it could be topical. And moving into international part 2. So yeah, global imbalances. So there's a bit more balance of payments last summer, but global imbalances and how you reduce those. So policy to reduce it. Competitive valuations, depreciation. So China's competitive valuation. There's a question on that there. Effects of competitiveness. A lot of the questions have been on policies and measures and factors influencing it. But the economic effects of it. So why is it, for us, why are we bad? If we said we've lost competitiveness, what would be the bad effect on our economy if we're less competitive? So there's a bit of scope for those questions. I've put the balance of payments hot topic there as a potential essay. That was asked in the previous specification as a 12 marker, but there's a lot of scope. That's a very broad essay. You could go into with deficit countries and surplus countries potentially. In terms of the financial sector, I've told you many times that there's been no essay set on this so far. So the one in the mock I made up, which is similar to the second essay there. There's a lot of things that haven't been tested. So equity markets, externalities, and a lot of the roles of the central bank. I think there's scope there for a question. It could be a 4 marker, could be a slightly longer question, but they haven't really gone through those roles of central banks. So that could be a short question they might ask here. And in terms of the S's themselves, I think they'll be broad if they went this way. So consequence of market financial market failure, roles of central bank, maybe roles of financial markets. I'd hope it would be a very broad question that you'd be able to answer. On that, bring your knowledge in from the financial crisis in the UK and the US. Then this is the first part of the development pack. So things that are missing, some other indicators potentially, other than HDI, so individual indicators, GDP as a measure of development, savings and foreign exchange gaps, absence of property rights, non-economic factors. So again, these are sort of things that keep, each year they seem to be ticking off this list of different things in the development unit. So could easily have, 12 markers, 4 markers, whatever on these sort of questions. So you can see that difference between savings gap, foreign exchange gap put there. And I don't know if they do this as an essay, but the measures development, there's been an essay on that. So potentially last year they had one on factors in development. So it's another big topic in development. So I put effectives of GDP and HDI. So maybe the pros and cons of those would be your KAA and evaluation paragraphs. And then again, there's just so many little topics here in development where they could test them. So you can see here, joint ventures, FDI, privatisation, moving subsidies, lots of individual policies which they could get tested as a short question. Tourism, the World Bank, NGOs. There's a lot of scope here of things that they could do as individual questions. But there's also scope if they wanted to, of course, to do a sort of broader essay. So they could follow up their first major development essay last summer with, rather than the factors influencing, they could start thinking about the methods to promote it. So I've put here one specifically on interventionist strategies, promoting growth in LADC. So what sort of things could they do? And again, using Bolivia or Ghana, and these are either strategies they are doing or strategies you think would be helpful for them, knowing what you know about those countries. So that gives you a bit of an overview on the macro side and some hot topics you can think about. We'll again look at some other examples in class when we get back.